Welcome to Live from the Future, where we explore frontier tech that will change the world. My name is Wiz, and you can find me on Twitter at WhimsicalWiz. Unfortunately, Elon Musk could not make it today, but in his place, we have Michael Dempsey from Compound. Michael is a partner at Compound that invests in frontier technologies such as robotics, autonomous vehicles, machine learning, immersive computing, and AI and ML for creative work, which is our topic for today. Today, we're going to be talking about the future of artificial intelligence and machine learning in creative work. Prior to joining Compound, Michael was an early employee at CB Insights, where he focused on researching frontier tech. And then he made the jump into venture when he joined Rothenberg Ventures in SF. Mike, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's take a moment and teleport to the future together. Are you ready?
I'm born ready.
All right. It is now 2030, 10 years from today. Tell me what the future of creative work looks like and how artificial intelligence and machine learning has changed that.
Sure. So I think the thing that I would say is, if we look at what creative work is today, you have this dual abstraction of your traditional creatives, and we'll say traditional as some analog input devices, some of the things that have become a little more well-known, or technology that has become more well-proliferated, like Adobe Suite and things like that. And then you have this creative technology stack. I think that creative technologist, which is basically people that bridge the gap between creative use cases and emerging technologies or new types of input platforms. I think those people will continue to use machine learning at a higher and higher rate. And I think that will start to kind of become more of what a technologist is, similar to how Adobe Photoshop has become just a part of what a creative is. More of what a creative is. And so I think if we look forward in 2030, I think we see a lot more automation in the creative process, and it becomes more about like data curation, or trying to figure out how can you mold a machine to like create your creative vision, or to have some agency over the creative vision, but work with that machine or that algorithm. I think that spans into a bunch of different types of creativity, whether it's from writing, which might be a little difficult, to image generation or character design or game asset creation or things like that. But I think that the main underlying kind of change will be that the automation will be much more heavily integrated into people's integrated in people's creative flow, and secondarily,
VC slip.
Yeah, VC slip. And secondarily, it will be abstracted away from some of like the technical complexities that exist today in terms of versioning or environment setup or things like that. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the investments and things like that related to it.
Cool. Let's return to present day and explore some of those topics. You talked about some of that in your piece, Animation is Eating the World, and I'll link that in the show notes. The examples of machine learning helping speed up production, some of those examples you gave, and you go into them in your piece, coloring in of characters is an example when it comes to animation or in movie production. I had a friend who was like a compositor who like did like a lot of like very tedious work and like coloring in backgrounds and like blah blah blah. Easy to imagine a world in which machine learning helps with a lot of that and just makes the process smoother, brings down those $200 million avatar budgets to less, allows shops to produce more. On the other side of the coin, though, something you talked about was one day there might be a possibility to heavily modify or even replace human creativity. And that's very different than the machine sort of helping the creative human. There is conversation about the machine taking that over, like writing full movie scripts, generating entire characters, doing the actual creative heavy lifting. How do you see those two paths in the future and the distinction between them? What does that look like? Yeah,
I think the heavily modifying is probably the better word, though replacing is like a buzzier word that gets a little more hype and people scared a little more.
Yeah.
Ultimately, all these things come down like in like data sources and inputs, whether you use unsupervised learning, supervised learning, whatever you're doing, that you need to have some human in the loop to create those data sets. And I think one of the key things that we haven't seen is a lot of these, specifically in animation, so these animation-centric models haven't had its kind of like ImageNet moment. I'd say that the anime data set is probably the closest thing we've had, which is called like Dan Burrow, and there's different versions of it that come out each year. But similar to how you need a clean data set that is well tagged, large scale, et cetera, for something as generalizable as image recognition. When you get into these more specific creative use cases, you're going to need like more specific data sets that will enable these. And so I think the world in which where humans are modifying algorithms and algorithms are modifying human creativity or replacing in some way comes still from like a different level of creativity, which is today, if I want to generate new Simpsons characters, I still have to go out and figure out what are the right images to capture of Simpsons characters, what are the right ways in which I want to crop those images, how do I kind of manicure and make sure that this data set is really well done. And so I think it's just a different part of the stack, and you still need to have the creative mindset of like, I want to allow a machine to do this thing. And whether that is in animation or in something like fashion design, where you want to say, what are the things I want that this brain that I'm going to create I will allow to create for me to be thinking about as they're creating. And so it's like a mix. I don't know if we'll get to a point of having books that are entirely written by machines. I mean, we do today, but real like good books, I guess.
Yeah.
But eventually, I think that even that comes down to if you feed a bunch of stuff, Harry Potter text, like eventually there's a creative process in creating that initial text and that corpus. So it's kind of a debatable whether how much creativity truly lies in the algorithm.
And going back to that Simpsons example, does that start to take away from the actual creative minds who are like today are responsible for generating those like famous like Krusty the Clowns and like other characters like that? Or is it more of like a support where like I'm ideating on a new Simpsons character and like I get the system to just spit out like 100 different ideas just for me to look at for inspo, and then I take one of those and like further refine it with my human abilities?
Yeah, I think today and for the foreseeable future, we'll see this idea of like inspiration creation and human kind of fine detailing or modifying at the end. And even we see that today, like even when you look at things like StyleGAN and some of the outputs that they put out, you see in the press all these beautiful images that look really cool. What you don't see is like the 100 and 500 and thousands of images that like looked kind of weird that they chose not to push forward and show people.
Yep.
And so I think continually you'll see machine learning used as an ability to give scale, and whether that scale comes at the beginning of the creation process or the end of the creation process is not clear. But also you could start to see it as ability to like lower barrier for creation. And so there was a really interesting tweet actually yesterday of I can't remember who it was, but they put out a bunch of different characters from the last few Pixar movies and a few other non-Pixar animated characters where they had these like kind of zany characters, and they all had the same facial structure and the same kind of facial details.
Yeah.
And so maybe at times you do want a machine to throw out things that will have implicit bias, won't have explicit bias built in. Of implicit bias, meaning that data that you're getting in is going to have some human bias because someone is curating it that is a human that has bias. But the output is not going to be someone that says, oh, a zany character has to have a big nose or has to have kind of cool, weird curly hair or has to have some sort of facial feature. The machine is not going to necessarily take away the same things that a human will.
And how do those things enable the creative industry in the future? Like I gave some hypotheticals about how it may reduce budget of like some of those big feature films. Like what other things are you seeing in which studios would be really excited to adopt this over the next 10 years and it being like default in the future? Yeah,
so I think there's like first order effects of like driving down production costs, right? And so this idea that even let's call it like 6 years ago or 7 years ago, and James Cameron skews a lot of these timelines with the stuff he's done, but he's kind of an outlier in this industry. But in order to create a 3D face that showed emotion, you were kind of hand creating all these different little emotions and way muscles moved and everything like that. And today you still see a lot of that. And the best artists will say like, no, you need to be able to do that. Like this, facial recognition and computer vision stuff is bullshit. Like you got to do this thing. I think that just that idea that I can, in something as simple as like Adobe Character Animator, rig up a few different blend shapes and then map it to my face and start acting, and essentially like domain transfer from my face to an animated face is pretty mind-blowing. And the fact that the lips are going to move like the words I'm saying are is something that I think is a decade ago people would have killed for. And if you look at animation a decade ago, except for the very high-end stuff, most of the time the mouth movements weren't necessarily human or related to English as well. So I think there's like driving down production costs, and I think there's kind of that secondary thing of like giving scale. And as animated worlds become more immense and the bar at which you are not only racing against kind of like the best, which I would say is Pixar or Illumination and some of their things, you're creating these immense, very detailed worlds that are vast and expansive when you're looking at the screen. machine learning and even something more simple like procedural generation can start to really fill in a lot of those gaps. So having to have a human create a bunch of different 3D assets that are very unique and very tedious that maybe appear for 25 seconds in a frame.
And it sounds like some of those second order effects, we're able to start to play with them today and see what kind of interesting things we can do. But it's one of those things where we won't actually know what that unlocks until we get there.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think it's not only the technologists, but it's also the artists. Like one of the key things I've learned working with a team of artists over the past few years has been like there is a clear split in those that are willing to adopt new technology that helps them augment their creative process and those that aren't. And as of right now, a lot of the classically trained camp is not, because they are taught a very specific way in which creativity flows and in which they should exude their influence on their creativity. Others that are maybe not as classically trained, but are just enjoying telling a story. And the thing that they care about is seeing their vision come to life in some way. And they're not used to having the resources that someone who, was at CalArts and then interned at Pixar or Lucasfilm or something like that has, might be a little more willing to try and see how much of a trade-off can we give on initial quality or creative control for scale. And I think that's kind of like a trope that is very true with all sorts of industries, and we see that with robotics as well. And so it's like this continual idea of like both social and technological barriers.
How do you think that these new, we'll call them superpowers, will influence the consumer side of things? Like all of the examples we've been talking about thus far is how do professional artists and professional creatives, how can we give them more scale and speed in their process? Do you see these new tools and abilities bleeding into the consumer side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think we already have, right? Like Animoji is probably the best example. Everyone loves that. And like just the detail that you can get on Animoji from both like the machine learning that's happening on the edge of the phones and the hardware that is now kind of coming down in cost and can be on a phone is pretty remarkable. And so I think that's that idea of like, can we build new types of social networks, new types of digital identities, new types of expression, like a new type of GIF or something like that? Like why shouldn't it be more personalized to us? I think is interesting. Like obviously Morphin is one example of that. Put yourself in GIFs. Animoji is another where you can animate a character that kind of looks like you. I think that'll continue to happen. And I think similar to how if you look at even like photography, this tooling, very early on, there was actually a company called Prisma I think it was Prisma. They used like pretty simple style transfer on photos to allow you to say like, you can make your photo look like a Monet photo. And that was like mind blowing for people for like a month. And then there's all these weird privacy issues with that app, I think. I think if we look at photography as kind of a baseline, initially we had this very prosumer and professional industry built around people with DSLRs and really nice lenses and everything. And then as hardware started to proliferate and get better and like computational photography started to take hold, you then saw like Visco lenses and you saw like Lightroom. And then you had prosumer photographers spin up. And now like any person with a phone can make something look like what people before would have thought was pretty cool. And so I think generally we'll start to see that more and more. It's just ultimately like a photo is only as interesting as what's framed within that photo and how people set up that photo. And so I think similarly with machine learning, you might be able to do more interesting, cool things with the creative process as a consumer, but ultimately that aesthetic will die out and become less and less interesting, just like Instagram filters became less and less interesting to consumers.
It sort of raises the bar of what is the gold standard for creativity in that medium and allows the actual creatives to still, I don't want to say come out on top because it's not at the expense of like the average person, taking nice photos, but, I guess draws that clear delineation of like what is actual art. If photography, like if I can take as good of a photo on my iPhone as like an actual photographer, then there has to be some delta at the top of like what separates us. And I think that as we probably get closer to that line, the difference changes, the bar changes. Let's switch gears and jump into a couple of the portfolio companies that you've invested in and talk about some of these topics as well. One of them is Shadows, which you actually helped start and spend a bunch of time researching. You reference it in the Animation is Eating the World post. Give us a short version of what that is and what you're excited about with it.
Sure. Yeah. Shadows is led by Dylan Flynn and Corey Campdonico. Dylan's someone I've known for a long time and worked with at one point. And Corey's kind of a legend in the entertainment animation world. The main view is how do you tell stories on the internet in a new way and create IP around that? And then how do you build technological tools that enable that creative process entirely in-house, not with any view of ever kind of open sourcing those tools. And so that today looks like a bunch of tools that we've experimented in-house that we give to our creatives and allow them to hopefully have some scale. And there's a bunch of reasons why we did that. We can talk about that. And then also figuring out, where are consumers today? How do we tell stories that are interesting, largely through animated properties? And those where they are today is everywhere from Instagram to YouTube to Twitter, et cetera, and TikTok now as well. And then also even on like mobile games and stuff. And so we think there's a new way in which you can build a new studio. And a lot of that came from a lot of my nerding out on some of the early use cases for GANs, which was just because of research being done at like University of Tokyo centered around anime. And a lot of Dylan's time at CAA leading a lot of the new media stuff and Corey's time in the animation world for 20 years, seeing how a new studio could be started today and why now is kind of like a very opportune time to do that.
So, did you watch Bojack Horseman?
Yeah. So Corey created the show. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Bojack has quite a good Instagram account. That communicates in like a social media forward way to bring life to that character, which it seems like is part of what Shadows is doing. Is the idea that the way that the Bojack character is created and how that's like produced in the studio in-house version of that is outmoded, and that Shadows is like trying a new way to build that studio process that may ultimately lead to a similar type of online character? Yeah,
I think the Bojack thing is tough because there's a bunch of reasons why I don't want to talk too deeply about that.
Okay.
But I think that with Bojack, you see there isn't necessarily as tight of a loop, perhaps, as there could be between creative and the Instagram account and the stories that Bojack tells. And I think that if you truly are one entity that owns all of these distribution channels and all of these potential monetization channels, then you can start to do really interesting things that like Disney has figured out quite well how to do, which is some people say, their movies are basically just 2-hour commercials for all the toys and rides and things like that are going to happen. And so I think that if you can do that, but you can lower the cost of creation and lower the cost of distribution, where Pixar, as an example, will spend $200-300 million, go in a hole for 3 to 5+ years, pop up, release a movie, and basically hope to God it works. And they have figured out that it works basically almost every time.
Yeah, they're like multi-billion-dollar franchises around a lot of those movies when it comes to like the studios and the toys and the all the ancillary goods.
Yeah, and so they've done a really good job at that, and they're creative geniuses there and have been for a long time. I think there are other studios that don't have that same success and haven't figured out how to be as agile. And I think similarly, the easy comp as like a VC and tech VC is you can look at like software and this idea of like you used to have to buy all this hardware and infrastructure in order to just launch a simple SaaS product. And today you can do it pretty quickly. And there's a reason why you shouldn't do it the old way. And so I think media might be set up in a similar way where there's a bunch of existing studios and companies that are currently running their own servers, have their own clusters, have everything, have spent a bunch of money up front, and then they go for distribution, and it's very unclear where that distribution, how it monetizes. Where there are other companies that can spin up an AWS instance and push some software and acquire users much more affordably, and it's more clear why that's scalable and potentially has dominant economics.
It's like a rough metaphor that came to mind is like the old school studios are like on-prem and like these new studios are like the SaaS version of that.
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, it's hard to make the argument that in a decade they won't shift to like a cloud distribution model in some way.
I meant more like metaphorically than specifically where their stuff's located. Like old world versus new world.
Right, yeah.
And then for Shadows, it sounds like the machine learning and the AI is in the production side of the things. How do we quickly spin up characters and be able to produce scenes and things that fans can interact with in an easier way, in like a less capital intensive way than a studio? Like for Bojack, like there's probably like a ton of people helping produce all of those Instagram shots. The assumption is that with the help of machine learning and artificial intelligence, a studio like Shadows could do that much easier, and quicker,
or provide unique tooling for employees. I think one of the things that if you look at Pixar as one of the kind of the canonical examples of companies that do this, you can look at both Pixar and Marvel. And I think if you look at Marvel, you would say they're a really great IP house. They create really great stories and they tell them. If you look at Pixar, you say they create both technology and IP, and they use technology as a short and midterm moat to then tell great stories. And that technology was initially RenderMan on the rendering side and is still today Presto, the open source RenderMan. And so they not only have a different aesthetic and a higher quality, in my opinion, but also have some pretty compelling evidence as to why you should go work at Pixar if you're one of the best people in animation and not work at some other studios. And our view is that there are low-hanging fruit tools that we can both experiment with, and also that we can create at smaller scales and that will have lower data burden. There's a lot of things from like the core structural ways in which machine learning models work that will allow us to build in-house tools differently. So an example of that is fairly simplistic is when you're building a machine learning model, one of the things you worry about is overfitting that model to a certain use case or a certain style or something. For us, it doesn't really matter if we overfit to a single character or to a single use case because it's all internal. We're not production level software. We're not scaling across hundreds of employees all over the world or thousands of employees all over the world, and we're not giving it in the hands of people. And so average people, consumers. And so I think that allows us to, at the very least, experiment with interesting ways. And I think also start to test the bounds of working with creatives that want to augment their workflow versus don't, and seeing kind of in this almost like lockstep approach with some of the more traditional creatives, how do they want to adopt a new technology and where in their pipeline are they actually willing to be like, yeah, I want a machine to automate this out? And where in the pipeline are they saying like, this is cool that you can do this, but if I need to go back and change 4 things, then like, I'd rather just do it myself.
It sounds like with studios like Pixar, the magic is in both the production that we just talked about, but then also the actual storytelling.
Yep.
Sometimes when tech tries to come into new spaces, they miss out on the magic.
Yep.
Of like things like the storytelling. In this specific example, it sounds like there's some interesting things that you all are doing with the production side of things. Mm-hmm. Do you worry about the storytelling side of things? Like, will we be able to tell as good of stories or create as good of characters as like maybe Pixar's too high of a standard, but too much focus on tooling, not enough focus on like the actual storytelling?
Definitely. Yeah. So that's probably that was probably my biggest blind spot. And the person in the room that is like tech.
Yeah.
And Dylan and Corey are the people in the room that are like, tech doesn't matter if you don't tell a great story. Corey understands this probably better than anyone, definitely in that room. And I think Dylan does as well. And so a lot of the really the first year of working with the company and being there as partially an operational role, but largely as an investor role was basically saying like, ultimately this is a creative company and I understand that. And I am like not a creative. I like think I am at times, but understanding in that room, like this is not my job. And basically giving the keys to Dylan and Corey, who are the true co-founders of that business. I think is definitely like it takes a lot of self-awareness at times. And so there are times where you want to, you sit with an artist and you say, but you're doing all these things, and I could like, if we spent an hour with us, like we could potentially be able to automate some of this. And then them saying, yeah, but it wouldn't have the same feeling that I would have versus creating it, and like the emotions would be the same. And I'm like, it looks pretty much the same. And then they say, no, trust me, it's not. I kind of have to seed creativity. And so I think a lot of what we've done, not only on the creation side, but on the storytelling side, has been thinking through how do you think about both writing and art direction and character design and things like that, and then layering in technology into their processes versus trying to start from a technological perspective and like disrupt their creative process. Ultimately, if our view is we're building a decade plus generational company, which is the hope, technology will naturally seep in some ways. And so it doesn't make sense to us to over-index on the technological aspect too early on in the life of the company versus be able to have a deeper understanding of what are the right technological tools we want to build that are pretty high CapEx, honestly. And so that's been like a core struggle early on. And eventually I think it was, the genesis of the company was like, this tech thing is interesting, but in the end, like this is a storytelling company, similar to how Pixar is a storytelling company. And no matter what they do on the tech side, it doesn't really matter if the stories suck.
Let's talk about RunwayML, which is another company that you guys have invested in that's a lot more on the tech side and not on the story. It's enabling storytellers.
Yeah.
Share a little bit about the company and what you're most excited about, and we can jump into that and talk about them.
Yeah. So Runway is a company based in Bushwick, Brooklyn.
All the cool companies are based in Brooklyn.
All the cool companies, yeah. They have a super cool office. They share with Paperspace, and I go there and I feel like really not cool. They basically are enabling machine learning for creators by abstracting away some of the difficulty of setup and usage. And I think that one of their core beliefs is that computational creativity in general needs to become way more democratized and way more accessible versus these people that have an ability to like work within different terminals and different web instances and train models and things like that, and have a lot of compute in hand. So they basically live in this interesting bridge where today in the machine learning world, we're seeing new things come out really like every few days, every week, and they're able to put those into a beautiful user interface, allow artists, creatives, and even data scientists, machine learning engineers to both iterate on those models, use them in their production workflows, build APIs to softwares like Unity, Photoshop, et cetera, but also to now increasingly train those models and create custom versions of those models and custom checkpoints and upload them. So they're at this interesting place right now where they're both a really sophisticated tool and then also a really sophisticated community. I think that that's something that is rare, and I think that it's still early on, but they have an opportunity to kind of hold that community and be kind of the core core atom of this community of like creative technologists and machine learning researchers.
Is part of the work in democratization of that kind of stuff actually lowering the amount of sophistication that's required? Mm-hmm. As an example, like I've got a bunch of like designer friends and illustrator friends who probably have no idea what an ML model is, or like, and probably haven't seen like any of the even the old things like style transfer, which like, you know, are today like very common in people who know about those things. Is part of the plan to expand out from this like sophisticated group today to how do we get those designers and illustrators who aren't into that kind of stuff able to create stuff with the power of those tools? And what does that look like? I
think Chris and the rest of his team have been pretty intentional about doing that on like the UI side of like, what are the simple things you can put into the UI and UX of a product that will allow people who don't necessarily know what a checkpoint is, or don't know what latent space is, to use these tools. And so even today, when you open up the software, you have basically three pathways you can go down. You can browse the models, you can train a model, or you can run back into a workspace you've already set up. And if you browse the models, you can browse them through a couple different vectors. And one of the vectors is like, what does this model do? Is it image post-processing? Is it like segmenting? Is it video centric? Is it generation centric? And so I think even just the words that they choose to use is part of lowering that barrier. And the fact that like, I can send friends really interesting research papers, and then they can be like, cool, well, like, what am I supposed to do with this? And I can say like, oh, here's a Runway link. You can go run this, like take an image of yourself and you'll get like a segmented image instantly, or take an image of yourself and like, you'll be able to turn it into a Monet painting or something. Like they start to get that. And so I think it is a balance of how much do you want to, when you're building anything that sits in this like prosumer-ish world, and I think all of machine learning research is kind of prosumer-ish right now, you do have to balance like how much power do you want to give to the pros and how much do you want to simplify interface for the consumers. And I think they've done a really good job of building like a UI that allows people to feel like they have enough power to do anything they want, and especially export things out, but doesn't make people open it and be like, oh my God, like what am I looking at? What am I supposed to do? And that's one of the things that was like pretty unique is like during their time at ITP, they built this, and like just meeting them and seeing what, three of them had done as students in terms of product development was pretty mind blowing. And so I think that was kind of like the first thing of, it's very clear that these tools should exist, or a tool like this should exist, but having the mind to actually figure out how do you actually make something like this in product exist is something that I'm not smart enough to do. And they kind of figured that out and showed me, and I was like, wow, this is incredible.
I think we'll take the show screenshot and put it through one of the models for fun, or even a segment of the episode. That could be cool.
Do it.
It sounds like when we were talking earlier about studios and how they can use artificial intelligence and machine learning, it was a lot about speeding up the process and scale. Mm-hmm. It sounds like with Runway, it's less about that, and it's more about maybe expanding the creative abilities of creatives, like opening new doors to things that they wouldn't be able to do on their own, or even opening new possibilities to think about like a way of approaching something that like maybe hasn't been thought about before. Is that, how do you?
Yeah, I think it's kind of all of the above, right? You can do TAM expansion of how do you take a team of junior data analysts and turn them into, we'll call them like junior data scientists. So they're like some group of data scientists are going to flame me for that. And that allows you to say, hey, I'm one person that really deeply understands machine learning. I want a team of people to be able to mess around with the model I built and be able to do it in an easy way. And whether that provides leverage or where that provides leverage is not, it's kind of infinite, right? Because they work with text models, image models, audio, and anything. And so I think it is like giving more people these quote unquote superpowers. And then I do think it is this idea of like opening and expanding the mind of the creative, but maybe not creative technologist, and how can they use these tools that they thought were only for super advanced people to use. And whether that's something within professional industries like VFX or something within maybe less necessarily technical industries like journalism, like that's pretty interesting on both sides. And even within like education, we've started to see this a lot. A lot of education customers have come to Runway and are using it pretty heavily in their ecosystems from both computer science side and for a bunch of other creative disciplines, because they just like the idea that you're containerizing everything. And this idea of you don't have to have, spend 2 classes setting up a 80 students environments on like making sure they have the right dependencies installed and all these different things. You can spin up an instance of Runway as long as you have Docker running and like you're good to go. And now with the cloud testing stuff, you don't even need Docker. So I think it is very like general purpose. And I know it's very like VC of me to say that like there's TAM expansion and like the customer is everyone, but I think that is truly what they've gone for today. And I think the future will start to see more and more of where is the long tail versus where is kind of like the fat head.
So you invest in a lot of frontier tech spaces, and you don't have a background in creative tech and studio stuff, but you have an amazing command of this space. When you start researching new spaces like creative tech, as an example, what's your research process like?
Yeah, I would say it. So,
like, how long did it take you to get this level of like command of this space?
It's tough. So it always like splits, right? It's the creative stuff spawned from a weird focus on like generative adversarial networks and just like becoming obsessed with those. And that just comes from, I just am naturally always looking at like what is the research industry doing and what are they talking about. And like the initial genesis and is basically like I'd spent a bunch of time in self-driving cars, and I'll give a very short version of this, but within self-driving cars, you started to see more and more people applying deep learning for perception. Within that, you started to see more and more people using simulated environments to train these models. And then within that, you started to see like how do you create more diverse simulated environments, and how do you make sure that like the textures are more unique, and that all these environments are actually training the models in a robust way. And generative adversarial networks is one of those ways. And as I just started to read more and more about that, a lot of the cool, interesting, like applied research was weirdly in anime. And like, that was just the rabbit hole I went down. I'd say my process generally is like, I watch a bunch of different repositories across different core technologies that I think are interesting. And I read a lot of stuff. And then also once I start to kind of key in on trends that are interesting, I'll follow keywords within those trends. And so with that, I kind of have a funnel of information that's coming at me. And then from there, try and usually understand who are like the key, most interesting people I should talk to and learn from. And I've talked about this before, but it's kind of this continual process of like read, write, listen, this like iterative loop. And I think that idea of like being able to form an opinion and then put it out there and let people kind of be drawn into you or want to like shit on you on the internet because you're wrong, has a very like strong feedback loop either way. And so I think it is really that. And also the second thing I will say is that like a lot of people in venture are very generalist or more reactive. I take a different approach, and I'm much more like isolated in the things I look at. And so where I think the average VC has a lot more meetings they have to deal with, a lot more potential companies, a lot more things that they're looking at, like there's a large chunk of companies that I just don't end up meeting with because it's not going to be within my zone. That's where having partners is great. And also why having a more focused thesis within our fund is kind of allows us to be a little more focused with our time of learning. And like, that's something that I value a lot and like make sure to build into my schedule like at all times.
You've been writing about AI and ML and creative work for, I think, a few years now.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, you've only made 2 investments thus far.
Yeah.
Is that because there's not a lot of inbound flow out of those things that you're writing online? Or is it more so that you just haven't been able to find conviction around companies in the space that you're looking for?
Yeah, I think I've seen a lot over the past 2 years. Like probably like 3 or 4 years ago, unsupervised learning broadly was like pretty shaky and like wasn't really able to get to production level. And so you talk to people about, I've talked about all these interesting, pseudo interesting theses I would have, and engineers would be like, that's cool, but like this stuff doesn't actually work at production level. Now I think that's changed a lot. But I think the core thing has been, the core learning for me as an investor, as I've invested more and more, has been on this idea of like understanding founders who understand scale, and like the scale of like what taking money from someone like me means you have to build. And I think a lot of people within these spaces, I kind of liken it a little bit to VR back in the day. I think a lot of people that are in these like kind of creative overlapping technologies don't necessarily think about like the hyper capitalistic view. They think about the like enabling creative technology component. And when it comes down to like talking through, like, this is the scale of company you need to build, how are you thinking through the sequencing of that scale? A lot of the founders I spent time with very quickly start to realize that like business they're building probably isn't like $1 billion plus business. Like it's really interesting, and all of their friends in their echo chamber that are also creators are super pumped by it. And some semblance of people that maybe are less intimate on knowledge of the technology might be really interested and think it's super cool. But it turns out like selling to creatives isn't always the most hyper scale growth mechanism to build a business. And also just like the inevitable thing I always say is like, when things look like they've gone to shit in 12 to 18 months as a founder, like, are you going to want to keep working on this? Or are you going to be like, this new cool creative thing is out, I want to do that? I think we saw that with VR, right? Like everyone came into VR because it was like this super cool medium and there's so many things you could do and you could transport worlds and blah, blah, blah. And then like 18 months later or 24 months later, once people started to deprioritize headsets, all the founders left and they moved, like half of them went to crypto and then like the other half went to other things. And so not to be like totally negative on like founders within the space, but I think a lot of it for me has just been understanding the scale that like I as a VC exert on founders when we make an investment, and like realizing that often that might not be necessarily in line. And the second thing I think too is a lot of founders within this space have initially created or competed on like, our algorithm is the best. We spun out of this group, our algorithm is the best to do this type of creative use case. Algorithms are not a defensive moat in machine learning anymore. I don't think that like having the best algorithm works. You're going to be commoditized within like 2 to 3 months if you're lucky. And so then it really comes down to like, how do you build product and how do you build like a customer acquisition loop that makes a lot of sense? And I think people don't think enough about how do you build like really unique, interesting products, where in enterprise SaaS, everyone now is thinking about products, right? Like it's like the consumerization of enterprise. In creative tools, people think about like cool technology and use cases and how it can be applied. They don't think about like, once you break through the 30 people that like really care about voice generation in gaming, what is like the next 10,000 people that are going to use this look like? And also like, you're not only competing against the bunch of other startups, you're also competing against larger platforms maybe that have unlimited compute and unlimited resources to hire away your best talent that can pay literally 10 times what you can pay them. So I think there's like a lot of interesting dynamics within machine learning broadly right now, and they funnel down to creative machine learning in a different way. We have made one infrastructure related bet that is more machine learning infrastructure broadly, but it is on this idea of helping dissuade some of the costs that come with building heavy machine learning companies and training models more efficiently.
That scale mindset makes sense to me, especially through the eyes of a creative, being excited about the creative potential about it, not so much about, is this $1 billion business?
Yeah.
Does that mindset translate to other frontier tech spaces as well, where people are just excited about like the nascent technology, but don't really make the jump to like, how is this $1 billion business?
Yeah, all the time. I think like,
so it's not just AI and ML and creative tech. It's true of other spaces as well, where people are more focused on the excitement of the science and hey, this is really cool within the space, but not so much on the where is this $1 billion opportunity? Yeah,
I think so. I think the caveat I would say is that often the creatives are not the people in like the creative space maybe are not necessarily as deeply academic as some of the other areas I invest in. And so not only does that sometimes can be a good thing in the sense that you can move faster, or you're a little bit more of the kind of prototypical founder profile, but I will say that also can lead to less like allegiance for the problem you're trying to solve. Like there'll be people that I'll meet and like they've been working on this single problem in the lab for like 8 years. And like now is the time that they realize they want to start a company and like this is the time they want to go. I would say a lot of the people on the creative tooling side have been working on things for like less than 4 years. And so that allegiance component becomes a little bit different. I will say that the main thing that across all these spaces is like you have like a lower number of investors for follow-on capital. You have a lot of money at seed, but you have a higher bar for like understanding what is like the true value inflection point that happens between seed and A. And often it isn't something as clear as revenue. And so you're selling into, if you think about who you're selling into as building a company like this at the seed, you sell into building an MVP or a product, and you're selling into some sort of customer. But the person you're selling into to raise the A capital is someone who needs to understand your technological like problem set and your milestones and like why it's impressive, and be able to differentiate you versus your competitors. And investors are generally lazy. And so like they're not always going to have that type of approach. And especially Series A investors, there are fewer that are hyper specialized in certain categories. And so it becomes this interesting thing that we see a lot is like company raises seed. gets some interesting pilots, but looks like 4 or 5 other companies in their space, goes out to raise an A, can't really communicate as to why or really educate the market as to why they are uniquely suited. Pilots haven't totally converted to like strong recurring revenue. And so for the Series A VC that's looking at it, they're saying, I'll just, like, I have no incentive to move here. I'll just wait. And then they go out for a seed extension. And then who knows, like you can have raised $6-7 million and still not hit a massive value inflection point because these large enterprise customers on broader frontier stuff aren't going to meaningfully integrate you into their workflow if they know that at any point that they do this, you have 12 to 18 months of runway left. And so it is this kind of continual problem that a lot of companies have. And I think as there have been more investors, it's been better in some ways, but also companies can pivot around longer before they reach a value inflection point that a Series A investor would want to see.
That makes sense. Let's end on a quick fire round. So I've got some short questions. Just give me a quick response back. Book or movie recently on Frontier Tech that you can't shut up about?
Oh, man. I'm trying to think of one like positively that I can't shut up about.
Give me negative too.
Yeah, I feel like I've done a lot of negative things on this. I read a book. I'm blanking on the name, but it was about basically this guy. I'll tell the name after this. Basically, this guy went and he wrote a book about interviewing all of the astronauts that went to the moon. And the main thing, to keep this short, is that those astronauts have historically not spoken at all. And his hypothesis was now that they're toward the end of their lives, they're actually going to want to share more about their experiences of going to the moon, how that changed them. And it turns out they did. And so it's interesting because you just hear things that you wouldn't hear normal people talk about unless you have gone to the moon, and like how that changed your worldview.
That's cool. Top 3 creative tech startups that you've recently seen or that you're excited about recently?
Yeah. So I really like the Facemoji team. I don't know if that's creative tech, but like I think that's pretty interesting. I think what they're doing on the computer vision side is really interesting. I really like, there's like an animation one. I don't know if I can say their name, but they're trying to do more like animation scaling stuff, kind of some that we did in Shadows. Really amazing technical team trying to figure out like what the product market fit is there. And then third one, I mean, like there's a couple different companies trying to take aim at Roblox for mobile, but like a more like simple version of Roblox for mobile, and using pretty interesting storytelling dynamics. I think that's pretty cool. I just gave 2 answers that don't have company names, but yeah.
Number 1 frontier tech person that we should all be following on Twitter.
So I don't know if they are a frontier tech person, but Gwern. Gwern is like this researcher. I think the pronoun is they. And basically, they do all sorts of different types of research and structure in really interesting ways. And you can subscribe to get Evernote access to everything that they read. And both looking into like designer children to machine learning. They actually created one of the first anime data sets. That person is amazing.
How do you spell it?
Gwern.
Favorite part of being an investor?
You get to like hang out with amazing people every day that are doing crazy things and basically give opinions on them, and at some point you get to invest and hope to God it works.
Last question, least favorite part?
You do feel continual pulls of your time, and I think like the way in which you have no feedback loop, and thus you're not sure if anything you're doing is right. But I think the way I've dealt with that is like I have a very clear stance on type of people I like to spend time with and the way in like I like to do my job. And if it doesn't work out, then at least like I did it my way. And that's kind of what I tell founders is like, when you're building your company, don't listen to the other people, but make the decision that you can sleep at night if your company fails. Yeah.
Makes sense. That's it. Thank you so much. That was awesome.
Thank you.